Jesus was born in what the Apostle Paul called the fullness of times. Palestine at the time of the birth of Christ existed under the rule of Rome, but immersed in a Greek-speaking culture that we call Hellenistic. It is extremely interesting and significant that there is no time in the history of the world when we can define a culture that so closely resembles our own as the world into which Jesus was born. The Hellenistic world was big business, big government, and big entertainment. It was a time of high-level social activities, affluent lifestyles, and the development of science and technology. New ideas, philosophies, and religions abounded. Understanding the Hellenistic Roman world may be much more than an exercise in history. It may give us important insights into how the Church of Jesus Christ may relate to the world with which it has to do. In this series entitled The Classical Background of Christianity, Dr. David Lawrence presents 6 lessons to introduce the study of church history. Understanding something of the cultural, political, and technological developments of Rome at the time of the birth of Christ and the beginnings of the church should be of great value to the sincere student of the Bible and church history. We hope that this series will help you to understand the culture which the church dealt with and also shed light into the world which Christ lived in and impacted. And now, Engedi Ministries is glad to present the classical background of Christianity.
With this study, we are beginning a lengthy series of studies into church history. When completed, there will be 5 sets of tapes dealing first with the background of Christianity, then with the early church, with the medieval church, with the 2 great figures of the 16th century, Erasmus and Luther, and finally with the modern church. The first half of that last study being the Reformation and its aftermath, and the second half and concluding half presented by Dr. Richard Good, the history of the American church. Our study now concerns the classical context of Christianity. Because you see, our Lord was born in the context, not of the medieval world, though we look to the medieval world for the flowering and the development of Christianity, but in the context of the ancient world, what we call the classical world. A world shaped by pagans, Greeks and Romans. And of course, the interaction of Christians with that society is extremely important because that society had its impact upon the development of the church. Believing as we do that God guides that development along the way, still we must try to understand how that the ancient world had that impact. And so first we're going to look at the impact of the Greeks and then at the impact of the Romans. Now, as we talk about Greek culture, we are actually talking about 3 different periods of Greek culture, all very different. And the only thing that is common among all 3 periods of Greek civilization is that they all spoke the Greek language. Perhaps the only other thing they have in common is that they all employed a certain architectural form. That architectural form was called a tholos, T-H-O-L-O-S. It was shaped like a beehive, not quite a dome sort of a building, but more like a point on the top. And that was peculiar to the Greeks of all 3 periods. Now, the first Greek period has been called the Helladic period, and all of 3 of these periods will bear the root word of Hella, which is the root word by the Greeks for Greek. Because you see, in Greek, Greece is Hellas, not Greece. Greece itself is a Latin word. And so any word that has that root refers to Greek. Helladic means early Greek. And the early Greek civilization dates from 1900 to 750 BC. Most of what we know about that period was written by Homer, who lived in a later period and wrote about this early period. And he describes it as a time of great heroes. The Greeks came from somewhere up in the north, Indo-European people, into the Balkan Peninsula, and eventually conquered the Cretan people who controlled that area and took over their civilization. There is no lasting contribution made by those early Greeks other than some architectural monuments that we'll find at Mycenae, places like that. They've left behind ruins of their palaces. And, of course, the legends that live on in Homer's Iliad and Homer's Odyssey, the stories of the great Trojan War. Perhaps the greatest exploit of the early Greeks was when they went together to fight Troy and defeated Troy, supposedly somewhere around 1185 BC. And then, shortly after that, Greece was invaded by numerous seafaring people who conquered the Greek civilization. And there's a curtain that drops down around 1000, and we really don't know anything from then until 750. So in one sense of the word, the Helladic period extended from 1900 to 1000, because the last 250 years of that period, we know nothing about it. There is not one thing that has been written about that period between 1000 and 750. Not one thing has been written about it. Not one writing from that time survives, and not one writing of a later time about that period, because Homer wrote about a period prior to 1000. There are no monuments built during that period that have survived. This is the one time that truly is the Dark Ages. The only thing that survives from that period of 250 years, from 1000 to 750, are vases. And of course the Greeks like to paint pictures on vases, so you might think, well, we'll learn something from the vases. It is interesting, the only thing on the vases are geometric designs. So we still don't know anything. It is supposed that when these sea peoples invaded, that the Greeks from Greece, the Balkan Peninsula, evacuated, fled, and crossed the Aegean Sea to the coast of Asia Minor, what we call Ionia, today the western coast of Turkey. And in 750, the curtain goes up, and we see another Greek civilization, a second Greek civilization. This is the great, pure Greek civilization that is called the Hellenic period. The Hellenic period. It will date from 750 to about 330 BC. This was the time of great accomplishment. It is important to note that it really begins in Asia Minor. And the leading city of Asia Minor, and the most important city of that time period, of the early Hellenic period, is the city of Miletus. This is a city mentioned in the Bible, because in the 20th chapter of the book of Acts, Paul met with the elders from the church in Ephesus at Miletus. There in Ionia, a civilization developed that was entirely different from the early Greek, if we can use Homer as a guide. Rather than being an age of heroes, where they fought as individual heroes like Achilles and Patroclus, and people like that, as you read about in the Iliad, Odysseus, they fought together in a team known as a phalanx. So that everything changed. The method of military, the political system changed. Instead of having kings with a kingdom, they had a city-state. Most of the city-states were ruled by a single person who came to be called a tyrant, and they had a council, and they had an assembly, and they usually had some administrators as well. The tyrants really developed in the later Hellenic period. There seem to have been maybe kings at the beginning, but one thing is constant, there always were some kind of a board of administrators, some council that guided the affairs. And we get our word political from the word polis, which means city in Greek, city-state. And there in Asia Minor, where the weather is usually very good and people like to get out in the open air and communicate with each other, they begin to exchange ideas. And we find the development of certain characteristics of civilization that have become hallmarks of Western civilization. For instance, the writing of history in its modern sense. Up to that point, history was largely a matter of records, of annals and chronicles, usually records of some great king, sometimes records of cities, but it wasn't interpretive history. It wasn't a historian studying and giving you a viewpoint and commenting and making it like, indeed, a story. But we begin to see the writing of history in this sense in Asia Minor with Hecataeus, Herodotus, and Thucydides. Herodotus gives us the story of the Persian War, the great conflict of the Greeks against the Persians. But in the process of telling his story, he tells us about 20 other different civilizations, and he's just fascinated with all these different people. He goes to Egypt and takes the guided tour of the pyramids, and he writes about Egypt. He writes about the Persians. He writes about the Lydians. He writes about the Scythians up in the area of Eastern Europe. Everybody he can find out about, he begins to write about. It's a fascinating history. Thucydides gives us a very scientific history of the Peloponnesian War, that is the war between Athens and Sparta, two great cities. So we find history beginning. We find literature. Of course, in the early period, Homer, writing the stories of ancient Greece, of the Helladic period. Many other writers come along. Poets will be writing, like Pindar and Sappho, the female poet. And we find lyric poetry. And then we find poetry in the form of drama. Let me just tell you for a moment about drama, just very briefly. Drama is a contribution of the Greeks in the Hellenic period. Prior to that, there was no drama. Drama was developed in the 6th century BC in Athens. In the 8th century, 7th century, and early 6th century, Miletus was the leading city. By the time we get to the later 6th century and into the 5th century, that leadership transferred back to the mainland of Greece to the city of Athens. And Athens became the cultural leader. And there in Athens, there was a politician who was a tyrant, a leader of the city of Athens by the name of Pisistratus. And as Athens had developed and made moves more and more progressively toward democracy, Pisistratus was very interested in taking power away from the nobility and giving it to the lower class people. At that point, the nobility still had a good deal of power that they could exercise through the priests. They were in collusion with the priests and had been for a long time. And as long as the priests had power in the religious arena, the nobles who, in a sense, controlled the priests could exercise control over the people through religious ceremonies, religious ways, you see. So Pisistratus decided, if you can't just go in and annihilate the priests, that wouldn't be a very wise move to make politically. At least we can create a new religion, a new form of worship that will be in competition with the old system and will be more popular, and we will attract people away from the old religion to our new religion. So if you want to make a popular religion, you want a popular god. What god would be more popular than Dionysius, the god of wine? He's a fun god. And so they devised a worship service for Dionysius. They built a great arena, and they planned that Dionysius, after there had been a libation, a sacrifice poured out, and by the way, every theater has an altar in it, every Greek theater, and there was this worship pouring out of sacrifice to Dionysius, and then in worship to Dionysius, plays were performed, and the priests sat as judges of the drama, of the plays. The first theater that was built is still the largest theater ever built in Greece. It's the Theater of Dionysius at the foot of the Acropolis, seated about 30,000 people, and you can still go there and see the seats where the priests sat with their names still on those seats, and they were the judges of the plays. And they had the greater Dionysia and the lesser Dionysia, one in the spring, one in the fall, and everyone who wanted to submit in this worship service, which became a contest, would write 3 tragedies and 1 comedy. And then the priest would judge the best one, and he would receive the prize. And drama developed out of that context, so that soon every city in Greece had a theater, and they began to put on plays. And so we have the great playwrights like Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, who wrote tragedies, and Aristophanes, who wrote comedies. In addition to poetry, drama, history, we have law developing, and the Athenians particularly highly developed law and law courts. By the way, if you were on trial, you had to defend yourself. You couldn't have a lawyer speaking for you. You could have counsel ahead of time, but then you had to actually speak before the jury. However, you could get someone to write a speech for you. And we have some of those speeches that were written. You paid the person to write a speech for you to defend yourself, and we still got those. They're very interesting. We also find the development of philosophy. We'll talk more about that later. Philosophy is the attempt to understand the world by human reason, not by revelation, but by reason. We have the development of democracy. Democracy in Athens particularly, where the people actually ruled the state. Direct democracy. I don't mean representative government such as the United States has, such as we see later in Rome, but we see in Athens that people, common people, actually ran the state. They just took turnabout doing it and drew names out of a pot for who would be the rulers. And the development of humanism, which we'll talk about in our third study. All of these things started in, with the exception of drama, which started in Athens, the rest of them started in Ionia. And this is a very strong culture, very strong civilization that involved people. And it's a dynamic civilization. And what is very interesting is that it replicated itself. It spread. We might say today, it cloned itself. It did so in an interesting way by the process of colonization. For various and sundry reasons, the Greeks would establish new cities. And the new city would be the colony, and the old city from which the people came would be the mother city. And over a period of about 200 years, from 750 to around 550, the Greeks established 1,000 new Greek cities. 1,000. Just all carbon copies of each other, with the same government system, with administrators, council, assembly. They would have a herald who would take a torch, light it from the hearth of the mother city, and carry that then to the new colony and light the hearth of the new city. Now, some of these colonies were established because of overpopulation in the mother city, sometimes because they wanted to get on the trade routes, like Byzantium, sometimes because they wanted a strategic military location, sometimes because they needed more land, sometimes because they were chased out, sometimes they just wanted to establish a new city. Miletus established 45 cities. Just that one city established 45 colonies. And if you go into the Mediterranean today, you find areas that were Greek colonies that now are still there as big cities, like the city of Naples in South Italy. All of South Italy were Greek cities. That was called Greater Greece. Syracuse in Sicily. All of the cities of the French Riviera, like Cannes and Montpellier and Nice, were Greek colonies. There were Greek colonies all around the Black Sea, Greek colonies in Spain, Egypt, North Africa. It was amazing, the spread of Greek civilization. And then there's the third period. This period we call the Hellenistic period. Hellenic, Hellenistic. Hellenistic means Greek-like. It started in 330 BC. Politically, it lasted only about 100 years until the Romans overpowered it. Well, at least they have overpowered it in every place except Egypt. And that lasted about 300 years. But culturally, the Hellenistic culture lasted for hundreds of years. And I cannot give you a single date that would just say, here's where the Hellenistic culture ended. What I will tell you is this, that eventually it was replaced by Christianity. That Christianity comes along and is the only power that is able to replace the Hellenistic culture. Because when Rome took over the Hellenistic world, the Roman culture was not strong enough to replace it, and hence the Romans simply assimilated to the Hellenistic culture, and the Hellenistic culture continued. Now, what's important, what I want you to realize is, this is the culture into which our Lord was born. This is the culture which was dominating at the time of the beginning of the church. This is the culture that the apostles had to deal with as they went out preaching the gospel, the Hellenistic culture. So it's very important that we understand the Hellenistic culture. First of all, how did it come about? Well, it came about because the Greeks couldn't unite. They just fought each other. Athens was a very important city-state. Sparta was a very important city-state. They had worked together to defeat the Persians in the Great Persian War, and then they turned on each other. Particularly, Athens was very greedy for power. And so they fought a long war that lasted many years. And eventually, Sparta won, and Athens was defeated. And then Sparta acted high-handedly, and Thebes came along and defeated Sparta. And then the Theban leader was killed in battle, and it just seemed like nobody is capable of uniting Greece. And the Greeks were afraid that the Persians would come and pick them off because they were so divided. And so some of the Athenians wanted this new group that had emerged up in the north part of Greece to come and unite them because they saw a possibility that they could do that. They were called the Macedonians. And they found a great leader in a king who comes to power in 356 BC by the name of Philip II. And Philip didn't really need an invitation. He had that in mind. And Philip will, by well-timed military action and very good diplomacy, succeed in a 20-year period of bringing all of Greece under his control. By 338, at the Battle of Chaeronea, when he defeats the last two cities that were holding out against him, namely Athens and Thebes, he had everything. 2 years later, in 336, he was murdered under very suspicious circumstances. And his son Alexander took over the leadership of the Macedonian kingdom. Now, his father already planned a conquest of Persia. Alexander took that on as his personal challenge. He went to Thebes first and punished them for having opposed him and his father at the Battle of Chaeronea. And Athens he spared because he loved the Athenians. And then he started on this conquest of Persia, and in 3 battles, only 3, he conquered the vast Persian Empire. Now, by conquering Persia, the Macedonians came into possession of not only Persia, which is modern Iran, but Mesopotamia, which is modern Iraq, and Syria and Palestine. Remember, it was the Persians who let the Jews go back to their homeland, and Egypt, and of course Greece, and even into India and parts of India, an absolutely unbelievably huge empire. By the way, an empire that was prophesied by Daniel, the prophet, in the book of Daniel in the Bible. Now, Alexander died in 323. When he died, 12 of his generals began to fight among themselves for this empire. And when the smoke finally cleared in 301, it was divided really 3 ways. In one sense, 5 ways. 3 major kingdoms, 2 smaller ones. Ptolemy took Egypt, the African part of the empire. Cassander and later Antigonus Gonatas and his descendants took Greece and Macedon. Seleucus and his descendants took the Asiatic part of the empire, except for Bactria, which for a while was an independent Hellenistic kingdom in India, and Pergamum, which was an independent Hellenistic kingdom in Asia Minor. And now we have great monarchies, great kings ruling over vast territory. The culture that developed in the Hellenistic world was entirely different from the Hellenic culture. They still spoke Greek. They built tholoses, yes, but their culture was different. Why? Because it was a mixture. Now, think of a blender. You want to make a drink in a blender, okay? And you want to put into this blender all these things, these different ingredients, and blend them all together. So we start blending in Macedonian culture with Greek culture, with Egyptian culture, with Indian culture, with Persian culture, with Mesopotamian culture, etc., 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 and Syrian and all these other things are blended into it. And you see, these are great cultures because the Indians were very good at math and things like that, and the Egyptians were very good at science and astronomy and things like that. So all of these civilizations had their strong points. The Greeks with their philosophy. And when you blend it all together, it seems like the strong points were all there. They all were present. And so you have this tremendously strong culture that takes advantage of the good points of all the others. It was a vibrant, dynamic, strong culture such as the world had never seen before. But you see, it's a very literate culture. It's a very sophisticated culture. And in this context, where all of them spoke Greek, and they're under very stable, strong governments, you find a system of economy developing, a capitalistic system with huge corporations. Systems and banking systems with checks and banking accounts and credit. You find big government, big business. You find medicine and science, centers at hospitals like at Pergamum and Epidaurus. You find theaters, plays, literature, discussion groups that get together, a very literate society. Everything is on a big scale, super scale, complicated, corporations, mergers. You get the point? There is no civilization in all of history that so closely resembles ours today, and scholars agree on this, as the Hellenistic world. It's almost scary that it is so close to the world of today. And that's the world into which the church came. And now you see the relevance of this study. It absorbed the Hebrew world. But the Hebrew world resisted the culture because Hellenistic civilization was diametrically opposed to what the Jews believed. Morally it was. The morals of God revealed in the Bible that the Jews and the Christians believed were not the worldly standards or lack thereof of the Hellenistic world. It was different theologically because in the Hellenistic world anything goes. All religions are tolerated. But to the Jewish and Christian mind there's but one God and one way. It was evidenced in the great conflict between Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who was a Seleucid king of the Macedonian kingdom, and the Jews. Antiochus wanted to break the Jews, and so he started sacrificing pigs in the temple and forcing the Jews to worship Zeus. And they resisted, and Judas Maccabeus and his sons gathered together an army and defeated 5 Macedonian armies and freed Israel, Judea, for about 100 years. They were independent. A tremendous conflict. The intellectual and cultural Hellenistic world into which Jesus came and in which the church began could not be more opposed to all that Christ is and stands for, and yet Christianity triumphed in and over that world. Roman culture was unable to overcome Hellenistic culture and accommodated to it in its regions, but Christianity triumphed. No society before or after until our own was so sure of its own ability and self-sufficiency. Yet Christ came claiming that man was dead in sin and without strength, and that he alone had life to offer. And yet the ideas of Hellenistic culture still invaded the church and have provided the basis of an ongoing struggle.